From Teachers Talk Radio. You can catch up with all our shows by visiting our YouTube channel or by listening back at ttradio.org. Don't forget to like and subscribe to enjoy more live education conversation from TTR. We hope you enjoy this show.
Outstanding and world-class vision and world-class this.
I'm a real leadership geek, honestly. I've spent my whole career reading books and chatting to people.
I just find the whole thing and the announcement, the way it's been announced, bizarre.
If you could move away from a model where teachers are so intensely focused.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Points of View. This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. So our first story today is about how the number of suspensions and exclusions has risen in a year. And a lot of the time, this is attributed to challenging behavior in classrooms following the COVID-19 pandemic. And I just wanted us to talk about that a bit because I feel a bit like the pandemic sometimes is used as too much of an excuse or reasoning, and other really important contributing factors are ignored, like how the decimation of so many other public services has put schools in a position where they actually don't really have many people to rely on or many services to rely on. Pupils with really challenging needs aren't able to be referred to other services in time. Children with medical needs or mental health needs have ended up on really long waiting lists. And I can accept that the pandemic has definitely contributed to those things too. But I do also feel like the lack of funding in schools, bigger class sizes. I feel like there are so many other reasons for the challenging behavior being presented in schools that are contributing. So I just thought we could discuss that today.
So, yeah, just to touch on that, Yasmin, I was also saying I had a guest on Teacher Talk Radio, I think it was a couple of months ago. I think it was my second last show, who also attributed COVID to absenteeism and a lack in faith in schools. So her argument, very similar to the exclusion, was that, let me get this right. So COVID lockdown told parents and students that you can do school at home, that school isn't that important. And this is also contributing to a lack of faith in schools because of what the COVID lockdown told them. So I'll sort of throw that in there, again, blaming COVID or saying it's the main reason for this because of what it's telling parents or what it told parents. So, yeah. I got to say I don't know what to make of that argument. I think it's a hard one to sort of disprove. Doesn't seem like it's completely right to me, but I do see where that guess was coming from.
Well,
it's
all these, sorry to jump in,
yeah.
but all these things, I mean, I find the argument on the face of it just quite unconvincing, really. And I think it's a very convenient one because, like you say, it is very difficult to disprove, which of course means it's the perfect excuse. Now, I'm not saying it had no effect whatsoever, but the idea that in 2025, children are saying, oh, you remember that thing a few years ago where everyone was sent home because of a pandemic? Oh, yeah, well, that sent us a message about how our country respects education or doesn't respect education, so I'm not going to go into school today. You see what I mean? Like, yeah. It sounds absurd when you put it that way. Now, like I say, I'm not saying it's not a factor, but to pin it all on COVID, especially now, I don't know why the conversation needs to move on from that.
Yeah.
But do you think that that's because it was so noticeable when we returned into schools from homeschooling, if the kids even attended, the behavior was different. I mean, the first thing that those young people came back to were those bubbles where, you know, all of the year groups were in different places, and that caused a lot of an awful lot of difficulties in terms of the behavior, because teachers were traveling between. So the standards that were expected, there was so much sympathy and understanding for the kids that things were allowed to sort of creep. Now, we can look at the fact that my daughter was in year 8 when COVID hit. So those kids are pretty much out the school system. She's now just about to finish her A-levels. So most of those kids are through the system, but I wonder whether there's a residual. So it's not the children, but the expectation, the standards. Even if you look at things like the GCSE exams, you know, maths papers still have formula sheets because they were brought back in during COVID and they haven't yet been removed from the equation. So we have standards been lowered by us unwittingly, you know, not on purpose, but we had to make a change to how we recognize that children would have had some very different experiences while they were locked down, as it were, during COVID. It's an awful thing to say, isn't it?
It felt like that sometimes.
You know, yeah, it did. And so we recognized that. So I think there was quite a lot of leeway given to certain things. We had some terrible fights at my school, some real problems through kids in year groups just not being kept apart, you know, the kids who you normally were able to keep separate. And so I think, and also parental expectations have changed now, I think, and I think that's a massive, massive deal, that parents also feel, you made all this fuss, you fine us if we take our children out for a day, and yet kids didn't go in before. I don't believe it anymore.
But there was a reason why. I mean, and it wasn't just schools came up with this wacky idea. You know, it was a whole nation drive. Yeah. It was very much regarded as that sort of once in a generation, or once in a lifetime experience. It's a global pandemic. There's this idea that we shut down schools because we don't respect education. That was not the message then. I don't know where people got that message from.
It's the message that's been reved, though, I think.
You think so, Lucy? That's a really interesting, because that's what my guest was saying, not to keep plugging my own show, but just coming back to that. But have you ever had a parent say directly, or is it more of a, I guess that's what I'm getting at, like what actual evidence is that parents are thinking this, or is it, we've got a thing that happened, a way that parents are, and we're saying, oh, this must have led to this, when actually maybe if we looked at long term, there was already a growing problem. I don't know. I mean, have you ever had a parent say, well, you shut down, so why is school important? Is it more of a vibe? What are you noticing?
Well, because I hear it on the radio. So, you know, I listen to a lot of sort of phone-in type shows, and people do say stuff like that. So it's all very well. We look at education from a certain perspective, and we obviously recognize the value of it, and we see the impact. You miss one lesson, you know, then that's a sort of a disruption to the continuity of your education of that particular topic or subject area. But, you know, parents who for years sort of, you know, said, well, we've got to do that at the weekend because you can't do it in school. I think a lot of people suddenly thought, what's the point? It didn't matter. It didn't affect you. Kids still came out. They still got jobs. Do you see what I mean? And I just wonder whether there's a sort of an overall sense, rather than anyone specifically saying it. But, you know, if you excuse something once, you can excuse it 1,000 times. So it won't matter. We'll go out and get your prom dress, you know, today on Wednesday, because it'd be
well, let me ask a question, because I totally agree with what you say, Dave. It's kind of an unfalsifiable hypothesis, right? You know, it's a sort of belief, and it's very hard to really prove it or disprove it. But let me ask you this question. What's the problem in schools? Show me the problem in schools that COVID created. I don't deny that it affected things, and I don't deny it might have accelerated some problems, exaggerated some things. But what's the issue that we have never dealt with before that we're suddenly confronted with now that the pandemic's over? Yeah. And if there is one, therefore I think the answer is to double down on the things that we know works. I mean, you talked about behaviour, Lucy. Yeah, if you're having issues with the behaviour, well, we all know what works with that robust behaviour systems, blah, blah, blah. We know what works. We just have to be a bit more robust in our response to it, rather than say, oh, it's something that sort of is novel. If anything, it's just an acceleration of what we're used to dealing with.
What were your thoughts, Yasmin? Sorry, you were about to.
One thing I was going to say that just off the back of what Lucy said there, that just it reminded me of this was one thing that I do feel like isn't emphasized a lot when it comes to COVID, even though like I actually agree with both of you, Dave and Will. One thing that I think that isn't really thought about or remembered as much is how different the COVID experience was for everybody. And I don't mean just about, whether or not you had a garden, but I mean the way that, I remember teaching children who lost, quite a number of primary family members in their household to COVID. And then other children who had spent the whole time baking and, dancing and like learning new things. And I think if anything, to me, COVID kind of fractured that sense of community. I feel like it kind of promoted individualism a lot more because of how different people's experiences were. And I feel like I've never heard it really kind of considered in how that might impact behavior or parental expectations when it comes to school. But I do remember feeling a sense of when I came back, there were some children, what do you say to a child who's lost their parents or their grandparents, and another child who saw COVID as a really fun time to scroll TikTok, and I just think if there's anything, it's just really changed. So like to answer your question, Will, I think if there's anything COVID did really do quite badly, I think it's create this massive divide between people in terms of how they were impacted by COVID. And I do wonder, like, I don't really feel like anyone's really measured and I don't really think it is quantifiable, in fact, how that impacts a school. But I do think it contributes a little bit. But I will also say, I agree with you, Dave, that I think this was a problem that was already kind of on its way, and it just kind of got exacerbated by COVID in the sense that, like, and I'm sure I've mentioned this in previous shows, but one thing that just really gets to me every year is how normal it is in September for tabloids to run stories about children refusing to follow school rules. You've always got someone on the cover saying, I didn't want to wear school shoes, or I'm in trouble for my haircut. And, and it's like, why do these things make the news, and what impact does that have on parents? And, so.
I see what you're saying, Yasmin, but to me, the culprit, as it were, isn't COVID-19. That's inequality, right? But kids were always having different experiences in their homes. Just COVID made it more obvious. But the difference in children's backgrounds and the effect that would have on their education, that's always been there.
Absolutely, but not to that degree. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, I don't think it would previously have been normal to teach, a significant proportion of a class that have lost a family member all in the same term to like this really sudden virus. Like, yes, these disparities did always exist. That's totally true. But I think, children grow up with a sense of knowing or understanding differences. I think there was more of something about COVID was like an added layer of tragedy that was really different to normal disparities in society. So, I mean, I just thought of that, off the back of what Lucy said. But I do definitely think that other really important things are ignored as well. Like, the massive reduction in funding, like schools don't have enough, like class sizes have gotten so big. There's staff members that I remember, I've been to schools where non-teaching staff who often helped regulate children or were just kind of plugging really important gaps just disappeared, didn't come back to school, and I just think a lot of things like this are ignored. Some schools now have there's an increase in internal alternative provision. I could barely speak. I should really get up earlier in the mornings. But there's been an increase in like internal AP, where now a lot of schools, when they've got persistently disruptive students, and I think that article said the biggest reason for suspensions or permanent exclusions, I can't remember, is for persistent disruption. A lot of schools now put those pupils into those internal AP, so they're not adding to the statistics, whereas other schools can't afford them. There's also, I think, a drop in population. There's a dip in the birth rate, so there are less children, and again, less money for schools. And, I think a lot of these things are ignored. And, I do agree that I think the pandemic is being overly emphasized at times. And, why is there never really kind of any accountability for what the government are doing to support schools? And, I think about those things a lot more in my head.
Sorry, Lucy, what were you going to say before?
I've no idea, but I think I really agree with you, Yasmin. To be fair, I think you're absolutely right. There are so many different things surrounding it. I think the only thing I would say is that if we look across all of society, COVID was a line in the sand, and many things have never returned to how they were before. So, you know, if you look at the work from home and all of those things, and I think that for a lot of people are really angry about everything now. I think that, you know, it's had a whole scale effect. So I don't see, I agree that what we could have done is greater access to other underpinning and support services as a result of it. And so all of this has come all at the wrong time. I mean, you know, I think we were going to discuss, or we did discuss about, you know, the fact that schools funding is going to be sort of even lower because of the pay that's got to come, you know, the pay rises that have got to come out of existing budgets. And so it looks as though those support staff are going to be even fewer in number in classes, just at a point where we need more help and support in classrooms, and that's going to be reduced. And, you know, at the end of the day, nobody ever excludes a student, I don't believe, without really good evidence as to why that student has to be excluded. And they will generally have had to have gone through all kinds of different programs of trying to engage that student, to support that student in different ways. But there does come a time where you have to consider the safety and the learning of other students. And so I hate the idea that people have that, you know, school exclusions are a sort of flippant thing, you know, the implication that you just get rid of kids that you can't really be bothered with, or that are
my son came in with the wrong haircut and they threw him out of school, right?
Yeah.
Like you were saying earlier, Yasmin, and you actually did it. I don't know if you knew you were doing it. You did the folded arm thing and the frown. Frown.
Just on that behavior thing, I've written down a lot of questions because I'm just thinking through a lot of stuff. I teach at a sixth form college. I think you said quite a while about, Lucy, about standards dropping. I don't think they necessarily, I think they are sort of coming back. I think we had to at the start. But I think when I look at the exams, I think that was 5 years ago. Was there a difference with the students for a couple of years? 100%. I don't really see it that much anymore, but I know from high schools there is a lot of talk about behavior and that it's got worse. So maybe it is that those students just aren't getting to sixth form. And when it was just touched on about behavior, is there something happening in schools? Because I tend to think this, again, I have no evidence apart from just stuff I've read and, you know, talking to high school teachers, that there just is more and more, what would you say, need to focus on students who want to do well. So schools are getting to the point where they're saying exactly what, you know, one student is not going to disrupt the class. We're going to use internal suspensions. We're going to be stricter. There seems to be more of a mindset, whether you agree with it or not, that's a different argument. Is that because the behavior's got worse because of COVID? Are schools changing just because there's a bit of a mind shift of, no, this is a line in the sand, behavior has got out of control? You know, what evidence, I guess, those of you who teach at that level, is there that COVID is the reason for poor behavior and that this poor behavior is getting worse and that's why schools are reacting? And that's
that's a really good question, Dave. And this is the thing. I feel like so many factors are so like inextricably linked that it's really hard to know what is, you know, the most defining kind of cause. But one thing I will say about COVID, when we came back from lockdown, I actually thought behavior really improved. Like kids were behaving differently. But I remember thinking behavior improved because kids were in masks. We had these additional measures at school that we'd never had previously. Things like lining up, keeping a gap. We didn't have, like, you know, some schools have really strict lineups in the playground and, you know, they might have to walk into the building in silence. We didn't have anything like that. I was in, you know, a really friendly and kind of calm school, but you know, children would sometimes push each other in the corridors or whatever. But because there was, you know, this really strict no hands rule, you know, you keep a distance. I actually remember lesson entry actually improved, like during COVID when kids were in masks and stuff, and a lot of teachers were commenting on it. And I know that's, you know, a bit of a trivial example in the grand scheme of things, but I just think that it's so hard to kind of separate. And I think this was something that was already kind of spiraling. There were problems that were, you know, emerging and kind of building up. And then exactly as, you know, Lucy said, it was kind of like this line in the sand. And I actually feel like it also exacerbated a lot of existing issues. So COVID for me just kind of exacerbated things, but a lot of those problems were already there. And I just think the lack of funding is just a far bigger problem and that's got nothing to do with the pandemic.
Do you think, Lucy, that behaviour's got worse over the years, or?
Well, I have been out of education for 3 years now, so I can't comment on what it's like now, but I did 2 years after the pandemic, and the difference was remarkable. I mean, you know, Yasmin, you're saying that entry into classrooms was so much better, that kids wore masks. It was such a different experience at the school I was in, where kids literally just refused to go with the rules. You know, we were told if you see a child without a mask on in a corridor, you're to tell them to put it on. Good grief, they would not listen. They would laugh at you, they'd run off. It was hugely noticeable that discipline was completely gone. You know, it just changed everything. And I don't know whether I don't know. I mean, I often think schools in London, my perception is that they are probably ahead of other areas in terms of discipline. There's more of a focus. I think that you have I can't really explain it, but our school was a large, sprawling, rural secondary school. So you had kids coming in on buses from all over the place. So the discipline could start nice and early in the morning on the buses where there was no supervision. And by the time they got in, they were kind of ready for a day of arguing back all the time. So no, I didn't have that same experience at all. It's really interesting.
I've just had a thought. I do wonder, just based on what you said there, Lucy, I wonder if particular areas with a really high death toll or like COVID rate or like populated areas might have contributed to how good or bad behavior was. Because I'm based in Newham, you know, it's an overcrowded area. Yeah. It's got really high rates of poverty. And I do think very much that the children were very scared, because even if they weren't personally affected, they probably did know somebody at school or, you know, one of their peers who'd lost a family member or a member of their household. And I do think that might have carried over into the compliance that I saw that I never used to previously see at school, or the additional compliance. But that's just a thought.
I think that's really likely, because when you were saying that about, you know, so many kids who'd had experience of loss of a family member, I can't think of any students I knew of that went through that. So yeah, I think that's probably quite true, because it was so unimportant to the students where we were.
I mean, I think the behavior one is so interesting, just like in the long term, not the sort of short term code, which I think is largely shaped by, like you said, family, who you know, where you live. But this long term aspect about behavior, it is something I'm really interested in, because really, I mean, I've been at the same place now for over 16 years. And when I think about all of, you know, the behavior, I would say now here in 2025, if someone was to ask me, I'd say, oh no, behavior is actually the same, if not better than what it used to be. Is it, you know, by the time they're 17 and 18, that there is a problem with actual students getting to A level because they're being excluded? Are we sort of protected in the system? I'm very interested in this idea that behavior is getting worse. I'm sort of on your idea, Will, that 5 years on, I just don't see it being. I think, you know, like what you were saying, Yasmin, the fact that we're lacking teaching assistants, people to help send students in need, that's got to be having more of an effect than whether, you know, a pandemic that's now, not saying it wasn't a big deal, but is now 5 years ago. I don't know.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I give my thoughts. So I'm at the opposite end in that, you know, I work in primary schools, and yeah, we've got children coming in. They're 5, 6 years old. Some of them, I mean, pretty soon we will have a post-pandemic generation coming through. So my point is, for a young child, it was forever ago. It was quite literally a lifetime ago. But to return to your earlier question, Lucy, the school I was working at the time, and I'd worked there a long time. I had worked there since 2015. No. Once things were back and routines were back in place, I don't think there was any obvious deterioration in behaviour across the school. There were a handful of cases where people have been, as you saying, Yasmin, personally affected by it. The big conversation that we were having was more around socialization. There was a feeling that some children, the very, very young ones coming into school at that time, might have missed out on, play groups and talking and sort of social skills. But we didn't panic about it. I think the belief was, okay, they're a little bit behind, but they'll get there. We've had children come to us who might be behind what we might expect to see at their age, but we get them there and it's fine. But no, there was no widespread deterioration of behavior because we're prepared for it, right? We do what any school does to get a good behavior policy. You need, routine, consequences, blah, 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 blah. I'm not going to go into all of that stuff now. That's a different podcast. But I guess my point, if I am making an overall point here, is that, COVID was a problem, but schools are we're faced by problems every day. We're faced by issues every day, but we're resourceful and we do know how to respond to them.
I think primary school behaviour, though, is different to secondary school. So I've worked in both. And what I noticed was the difference very quickly. In a primary school, children go to the same classroom, they have the same teacher, they have the same set of expectations, and they're known really well by their teachers. And when they come to secondary schools, often when we have sort of liaison with primary school teachers, they're really surprised at who's sort of, heading towards the sort of troubled end because, we never had that problem with him. And I think the issue is that once children go to secondary school, they have so much more freedom. So they have a lot of time traveling between classrooms, they're moving. They've got some teachers who have no disciplinary skills, some who are overly disciplinary, the range of different expectations, teachers who don't really know them very well, and they very, very quickly learn to exploit that. I remember year 7 saying to her, "Are you okay? You lost?" And she went, "No," she said, "I'm just pretending I'm lost so that I can turn up late." And I thought, crumbs, and I knew that.
Gave the game away there.
Very honest.
But I knew her, you see. And it's just, so they very quickly learn to exploit the freedoms that they get in secondary school that just aren't there in primary.
But that's a story as old as time. I mean, teenagers will always do that.
Just on that, all I'd say is, Lucy, I teach at one of the biggest sixth forms in the country. We draw from something insane, like about 100 different schools. We try, but you can't know all the thousands of students that come to us. And I don't know what it is. I don't know. Is it just maturity? I don't see that type. Is it because I teach a subject that's seen as being somewhat more academic? It's a large sixth form. Maybe some of my colleagues don't feel the same, but I would never say behaviors taken a huge deterioration and they come to us and exploit the radical freedoms they have at a large sixth form college. I mean, they don't even have to sort of stay on campus if they're not going to lessons. So it's interesting. I'm still trying to get my head around it. What's happening in high schools? Is it that high schools are actually doing a good job? And that's why we're seeing, despite all the talk, actually, maybe high schools are doing a pretty good job in this area. I would say they are. I don't think it is just maturity. And so we're getting to that. So should we move on to the next story, guys? I'm just looking at our producer. This show, just going back to our wonderful sponsors before we move on to the next show. This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational Publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Level up your professional development today. Sorry, I got something caught in my throat. And visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR. You can see it on your screen now, 2425 for 20% off today. So our next story is a pretty substantial one. This is the story on the BBC at the moment about teaching unions talking about taking the new Ofsted body to court to stop the new Ofsted program. So we're looking at, I'm just trying to bring up the story very quickly. Now, here we are. Teaching union launches legal action against Ofsted. A school leaders union says it is taking legal action against Ofsted over proposed changes. This is the National Association of Head Teachers, which will ask a judge to review plans for the new school report cards, which are due to be introduced in the autumn after Ofsted. Obviously, a big story. Ofsted's changing. I think, obviously, when Labour brought in these changes and Ofsted looked at what happened after, the death of Ruth Perry, this was probably not how they thought principals across the country were going to react, which just seems to be incredibly negative. And I'm just interested in what we all think of that. Who wants to start? Yasmin?
I think, I mean, I know there was a show recently where we talked about Ruth Perry, and, you know, it's a story that really touched me. But at the same time, I think about how there has to be an accountability measure. And even though I've seen a lot of talk about the fact that, you know, it can potentially have a huge negative impact on the mental well-being of school leaders, which I totally accept and have been a union rep myself in the past, I do feel as though I don't see enough about what they propose instead as an alternative or a solution. So, I mean, I generally would say unions have always disliked Ofsted. So I don't know. I just feel like I would like to have seen more about what they propose instead as a better solution, because as it currently stands, there has to be accountability measures. And, you know, it does seem to me as though Ofsted have tried to you know, take feedback on board and change things. But, you know, I would love to have seen more. Like, I'm all ears. I love to hear that the NAHT care so much about the well-being of school leaders, and I totally support that. But what are they saying is a better solution? I don't feel like I know.
Just to add to it, I'm just looking here. He has said, just to be fair on the NAHT, although they haven't offered a different system, they said that they totally believe in accountability. They don't want Ofsted gone, but they say it's utter nonsense. That's a quote, that Ofsted's proposed model was the only viable way to assess. The new system should be completely scrapped, think again, and that schools should be accountable. The new system looks worse than the flawed and dangerous system it replaces. So they're the full
I get that, because I can understand, because I mean, one thing I did think was, because I think they've made more, like the report cards have more like scoring points now. Like, so I mean, when I saw that, I did think, if you're already an outstanding school, then you've got nothing to worry about, because you're going to look even better than, you know, schools in the area that, you know, might currently be rated as good or requires improvement, because you're going to have even more points in between them. So like, I feel like it's just another way of making the best schools look even better. But at the same time, like, I mean, I agree with what the NHT are saying, but I would like to actually see more about what they recommend. And another thing I want to say as well, I find it so weird that I remember when I was first moving to Newham, I was on this like estate agent's website, and I found it so odd that in like reflected in the properties that they're like advertising, they will say, and we're in the catchment for local outstanding school or rated outstanding by Ofsted. I remember, like, I mean, I know it happens, but I personally find that so weird. And so for me, I just think about as well, is it worth addressing when a school might score low or might be rated low by Ofsted? What kind of can anything be done about the consequences or the impact that has in the wider area, whether that's estate agents or, you know, just kind of regulating how that can be used? Maybe that will be helpful. But I have really mixed feelings about this.
Do you know, I feel that the big issue for me about Ofsted, because I went to school in the 1980s. Now, there must have been some sort of school inspections. I believe that there were, but I don't know what format they took. But we had ranges of teaching from, you know, brilliant through to utterly negligent. You know, I had a maths teacher who would set the work and go and sit and smoke in the staff room and come back at the end of the lesson to answer, you know, give us the answers. And so we were largely, schools were left to fail, and it didn't matter. Nobody was accountable for results. Nobody was accountable for the issues in schools. Bullying was rife. Things that don't happen in the same levels now as they used to happen. So we need inspection. I think the big issue for inspections is the publication of inspections and the use of them in terms of league tables and, like you said, in estate agents' brochures about, you know, the sort of schools around the area. And I think that's the big issue. I wonder whether if we were to stop the publication of these and to find another way to, sort of promote schools. So, you'll always see them, won't you, schools. This school was rated outstanding by Ofsted and things, and schools love to promote that. And where they haven't got a banner, you kind of wonder, well, I wonder if you didn't come out so well from your inspection. So maybe the publication of them is the issue, because actually it comes from the same background, the same thinking as we mustn't use red pens to mark students' work because it's aggressive and upsetting for them, and it comes from that same idealism that we have to be kind all the time. But if we were to stop publicising them and they were for schools to use themselves, then maybe some of those mental health effects would be reduced.
I'm just unsure, Lucy. I think if I spoke as a parent, I think I'd want to know, if there are schools that are out there. I'm not saying there's many of them, but there are schools who let down students. There are schools that are poor. There are schools that Ofsted have rated as, badly, that really are bad. I don't think it's unfair. Sometimes it is very unfair, but I think we have to agree sometimes they get it right. And as a parent, I'd want to know, I would want to know if I was sending my daughter to a school that let down students. It doesn't mean I would. I want to know what they were doing to improve it. But I think I see where you're coming from. But I think as a parent, I would want to know what the school's like. But I do think one word is also a problem. But this is meant to get over one word, and they're saying it doesn't solve the problem. I guess in my head, I'm like, we all sort of agree we want it, and we think they're important. I think we in our group do. I don't know how you feel, Will. But no one can. Is there an inspection system that people can agree on? I'm not sure. Maybe we're chasing something that's like
no one is ever going to come out who works in education and say, I don't want accountability. So straight away, that's just a meaningless phrase. Let's put that to one side. Of course, we want accountability. And I actually take what Lucy says. I think Ofsted came in at a time when there was a lot of work to be done about raising standards. And yes, helping children who were being let down by poor teaching and poor practice in schools. Absolutely. We've talked about this before. My own personal view is that one word judgments are a bit of a nonsense. So I think scrapping those is absolutely a step in the right direction. And this system looks at least better to me. I've always wondered, because we sometimes think Ofsted has been around forever. It hasn't. The relationship between unions and Ofsted, will it ever be positive? Is a union ever going to come out and say, we've had a look at the new Ofsted proposals and we think they're just brilliant? So I guess what I'm saying is bear all this in mind, bear who's saying what in mind and what serves their purposes. We were talking about inspection regimes here. Yes, it can be done very, very differently. England, and I'm going to say England particularly because Ofsted is in English schools, is an outlier internationally in terms of being very, very centralized, coming through quite regularly and being very, very prescriptive, very, very thorough and very, very judgmental. Now, I'm not saying that that's necessarily a negative thing, but bear in mind, internationally, we are totally an outlier. Very few countries do it the way we do it. One other thing as well that I think I don't think it gets talked about enough, and I'm sure I'm not making this up. I'm sure I've seen it. I believe there's a new proposal. It's a pilot scheme, part of what they're putting in, that if a school is found to have sort of safeguarding issues, or not safeguarding, but issues that can be fixed quickly, there will be a 3-month period within which the schools will be allowed to sort of, address the issue that can be addressed in short term. And then there will be a sort of follow-up inspection at the end of the 3 months, which to me sounds eminently sensible. And I don't think anyone has a problem with an inspection regime where the focus is on improving the schools rather than just punishing them and then moving on and not coming back for 10 more years or whatever it is.
I'm just looking a bit more at what the NAT said, just going back to what you said, Yasmin. They're not very clear on it. What they say is that this system that the government's proposing isn't obviously fit for purpose. And what they want is a system that gets underneath, I'm reading the quote here from the union, underneath the surface of a school and its real strengths and weaknesses. Now, again, that's so we've only had a time, but what would a system that does that? It's so difficult, but I'm just looking at that thinking, what what does that mean? You know, like you said, Yasmin, you need more detail. What do they think a system is that would get to the real, whatever that might be, strengths and weaknesses of, you know, through an Ofsted inspection? And that I think
for me, one thing I do think about is, I think a very sad fact in teaching is, I just feel like on the whole, it's often a very thankless job, like on both an individual level and a whole school level. And I just think, you know, I mean, it's really obvious that the NHT are kind of coming from this place of, you know, they're school leaders. They know what it's like to run a school. They know a lot of the time there are so many things done so well in a school that aren't really reflected in the Ofsted, or are really hard to kind of quantify. And so, I mean, I don't have any answers, in all honesty, but I just think, you know, what can be done to kind of highlight or showcase the things that schools are doing really well. You know, I was once at an outstanding school, my first school in teaching. It was an outstanding school. I remember I had a pupil that broke their arm, and I wasn't allowed to give them any device. They couldn't write. It was their dominant hand, and they just would sit there, you know, and this was a SEND pupil. And then I went to another school that was rated good by Ofsted, and genuinely learned so much about how to support students with SEND. Genuinely learned, like I can't even tell you how much I learned in that school about inclusion. And, you know, but then when you look at their Ofsteds, one is outstanding. All the parents in the there were two schools really close to each other. Loads of the parents are applying to the one that's rated outstanding and not this one, unless, you know, they've got a personal experience there or a child that's already there. And, you know, I just used to think about these things, and because of that, I just never really cared about Ofsted, because I used to think, well, actually the things that are really hard to quantify, or the personal experiences of teachers and students, aren't necessarily captured that well by Ofsted anyway. So I think maybe Ofsted alone then isn't good enough. Maybe there need to be other ways as well, where, you know, schools can get an opportunity to be held accountable for, you know, the things that they are doing really well. And I agree with Lucy and Will. Like, I think Ofsted has, or, you know, these accountability measures have resulted in huge improvements in schools. I think one of the biggest probably being safeguarding. And, you know, I think safeguarding's come a really extremely long way in education. So, you know, I don't really know, but I can sense the frustration of the NHT there. And I honestly, like, I feel for those school leaders, because I understand what they're saying as a teacher.
I mean, I think the key word is trust. Right. I mean, and I wish I knew the answer to what I'm about to say, but I'm just going to raise this question and leave it there. But how do you build trust across the system? Because I think it's fair to say a lot of teachers, when they hear Ofsted is coming, they feel they're going to be caught out. They're not coming from a place of trust. You could argue the Ofsted model is driven by this idea that maybe they've got something to hide. There's bad schools out there and we're going to catch them. So again, my point is, it's not a trust-based system. Someone might say that's absolutely the way it should be. They shouldn't be your friends. It should be, you know, I don't want to say adversarial, but it shouldn't be a relaxing experience, because this is to drive up standards for the benefits of children. There is probably a different way to do it. And I think it's the way that some countries do it, which is much more where schools, they self-review with the assistance of an inspector. They probably don't call them inspectors, but the assistance of someone who comes from an external agency to work with the school, and they self-review, they identify their own strengths, their own weaknesses, and they come up with an action plan together. That is a model as well. But my point is, whatever change is made, if a change is made in the future, it will only work if there's a culture that drives it. And we don't have a culture of trust in schools now. I don't think we have a culture of schools trusting a centralized inspection body. I don't think people trust Ofsted. And without that trust, there can never be any meaningful change to the system. How we build it, I don't know.
Yeah, look, I'm going to plug a TTR show from October, where on the history of Ofsted, from the only person who's actually written on the history of Ofsted, Woe to Go. So if people want to go back to that show from last October. But one of the really interesting things, his name's Ian Luff, or Dr. Ian Luff. was that he said when it did start, Ofsted was much longer, and you had almost 12 inspectors, and it was a sit down, and it was this really intense but long, and you really got to know the inspectors, and there was a lot of trust. Now that went away, he said, because of funding. There was just no way that they could sustain that as they grew because of that. And I mean, the amount of permutations that Ofsted has gone in since when it was founded by John Major in the early 90s on a proposal that was made in the 70s under Heath, I think, or no, Callaghan. So it's actually incredible, its history, but the amount of change it's gone through and where it started, yeah, a lot of the trust was lost over many, many decades, but particularly under, I'm trying to remember the inspector, was particularly controversial under Gove. But
Wishaw?
Yeah, Michael.
Old Osborne head.
I just want to say I absolutely second that plug, Dave. That was I really, really enjoyed that episode. And that episode got me thinking there's two things. But no, it's a good thing. Two things. There's the design and there's the implementation, right? And it is very, very possible to like one but see the other as the issue. Yeah. So if you criticize Ofsted, it may not be that you have a problem with the way of the design and the intention. You might just think the issue is with the funding. Or, as you said.
The funding. It did seem from what Ian said that it started, as this intense but very long process, but it just wasn't. How can you? They just couldn't hit enough schools, and now it's come down to very sort of somewhat short, process. Not that many inspectors. I'd love to see. I think it just keeps coming back to what you were saying, Yasmin. What NAEHT would come up with. I'd love to see some proposals, some alternate ones. Yeah.
Also, I want to say as well, I think it's not just about school leaders as well. There's also Ofsted also can have huge consequences or a huge impact on middle leadership. Sometimes Ofsted come in and they'll be like, maths was doing really well, MFL wasn't. And it's when they leave, there's someone who's now, having everyone swoop down on them or, feeling a sense of responsibility for the school's overall grading. And I think that's really tough as well. I think middle leaders, not just SLT, I think middle leaders can really struggle through Ofsted as well. And, I've not really seen anything mentioned about I've just not seen any advocacy for middle leadership when it comes to Ofsted, someone running a department or somebody whose department has, gone through an Ofsted, sometimes they can be made to feel accountable for a school's judgment, and you can even read in an Ofsted report, sometimes certain subjects get highlighted, they kind of get called out almost. And that's actually quite sad and scary. And, yes, it's accountability, but I would also like to see something that addresses, how can responsibility be kind of shared in a school where you're not really just calling out certain post holders,
Sorry, Lucy, we haven't heard from you for a little while. What are your thoughts?
No, that's okay. I quite agree. I know of a story of a girl who was a sixth former who went into her art classroom to be able to have a look at some of the work she was putting forward for her A-level, and Ofsted were in there observing a lesson, and they asked her about radicalisation. What do you know about it? And she didn't, and it was mentioned in the Ofsted report. Students did not seem to understand what radicalisation is and those kind of things. So even the pressures on students, because when she read that, she felt that was a reflection on her. Now, that could have been loads of students that were asked, but there are definite issues with the way that Ofsted grade schools, and actually the effects of Ofsted after they've been in, where schools have been rated on a lower rating requires improvement or even worse, is profound often, and like you said, there's more to a school than the sort of a list of things that they're looking at. There's the culture of a school, and often schools with really good cultures, with really good sort of caring qualities, and children who are really, really happy at the school can come out with poor outcomes on the basis of sort of some more technical matters, and then all of that has to change because the sort of style of teaching. I'm aware of schools that have been told that they have to now sort of all lessons must follow the same format, because head teachers have felt that that's the key to pleasing Ofsted. If everything looks the same, you do, you know, a certain type of starter, and then you follow up a 15-minute, and it's just wrong, because it's taking personality out of teaching and flexibility and all of those things. So I think sometimes the outcomes that Ofsted has on schools that fall short of the expectations can be quite harmful at times. Overall, we have to remember that loads of different services are assessed under those same measures. So adult social care and councils, the children's services in Ofsted are also assessed using those same one-word outcomes. And it's really important that if we're looking at the effect on mental health in schools, that we look at those as well. And do we want to take the risk that by making inspections less upsetting, less stressful, that we take away some of the key qualities that can be gained from these inspections, which is simply to drive up standards?
Yeah, two things. I think inspections, there is no, I think an inspection that has no stress is like an exam that has no stress. I just think they're not worth anything. It's about levels of stress, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I also think, just on that point, I don't want to send us down another rabbit hole because we've only got a couple of minutes left, but it's just interesting what you said, Lucy. I see that more of a trust problem than, say, in Ofsted, not as in trusting Ofsted, as in trust in the UK. That is another issue. I was shocked the other day when I was talking to a teacher who was telling me how confined he was, not only in that he had to teach exactly the same as all the other teachers in the school, but in a multi-academy trust. Yeah. They all had to have these branded lesson plans that were exactly the same for every single teacher in quite a large trust, which just blew me away. But I don't blame Ofsted for that. I don't know where that's come from. I think that's a debate for another day, but I think it's nuts. And I think it's terrible, but I don't think it's Ofsted, but I don't know.
Schools spend money. They spend money that should be spent on staff or on facilities for pupils. They spend on consultants who come into schools and then tell them what they need to do. I mean, what is that? This is terrible. It's money being spent to pass a test at the end of the day. It's wrong. Who is this for?
And we talk about teaching to the test in the classroom, but in a sense, so many schools are sort of trying to get ready for the test of Ofsted. And what happens now with, the very short notice given for inspections, the schools spend almost their entire lives in a state of Ofsted readiness, expecting that
and that's not going to change no matter what. I don't think that will ever change. Labour could come up with the world's best system. Schools will always try and find a way to game it. I just think, I don't know, I'm very cynical that you'd have to have a radical rethink about even Ofsted's existence and what could a different system be. Do you have any final thoughts, Yasmin, just before we wrap up?
No, I mean, I've got so much to say about that, but if I get started now, we're going to be here all day, so I'm happy to stop there.
Cool. Thanks so much, everybody. I think a really good selection of stories. Thanks, Yasmin, for finding the one about exclusions. And thanks to everybody watching today. I hope you found it interesting. Enjoy the rest of your weekend bank holiday if you're in the UK or wherever you might be in
Thanks,
the world.
Everyone. Thank you. Now go listen to that Ofsted episode.
All right. Thanks, Neil.
Outstanding, a world-class vision, a world-class this.
I'm a real leadership geek, honestly. I've spent my whole career reading books and chatting to people.
I just find the whole thing and the announcement, the way it's been announced, bizarre.
If you could move away from a model where teachers are so intensely focused